Legal experts are saying Pete Hegseth has committed
an act of a war crime.
This is called the fog of war.
It sounds ridiculous, but this is where we are right now.
What's going on?
A senior cabinet official in the Trump administration having to deny a possible war crime. And a US admiral accused of authorizing a double-tap strike on 2 people stranded in the water.
Under international law, what we'd call that is an extrajudicial killing.
So as the US carries out attacks on small boats in the Pacific and the Caribbean as part of a much bigger war on drugs, we're going to look at what the Trump administration has done to get us here.
If this is anti-drug activity, it's clearly excessive. If it's a military campaign, it's really pretty inadequate.
And what could happen to this administration if they've actually carried out war crimes?
They're just killing people with impunity.
Since August, the US has been aggressively building up its forces near to Venezuela. Just look at this US airbase in Puerto Rico last year, almost empty. Now, fighter jets, helicopters, and gunships can be seen all over the base. And on top of that, the world's largest aircraft carrier, the USS Gerald Ford, has also been sent to the Caribbean as part of Operation Southern Spear. Satellite images from the 2nd of December show that it's stationed by the British Virgin Isles. At least 22 military strikes have been carried out on boats coming from Venezuela, which the Trump administration says were engaged in drug trafficking. More than 80 people have been killed since September the 2nd.
Thousands of American lives have been saved.
Republicans in the Senate have blocked 2 Democrat bills to curb that military action.
The motion is not agreed to.
One that would have stopped the boat strikes entirely, and one that would have forced Trump to go to Congress before attacking. And there have been questions asked by journalists, legal experts, and political opponents about all of these strikes. But it's the attack that started this campaign, the so-called double-tap strike, that sparked this latest crisis. So let's look at the arguments about the legality of Trump's Venezuela campaign, especially that 2nd of September strike. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and this is all clearly very complicated, but we've spoken to 4 legal experts, and they all told me that the strike on September the 2nd is a breach of international law. We know that after the first attack on the boat, a second strike was ordered and the boat was hit again, reportedly killing 2 survivors who were in the water. The central allegation first reported in the Washington Post is that the Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, gave the original order to, quote, kill them all. And because of that, the commander in charge, Admiral Frank Bradley, carried out that second strike. In military terms, this is known as no quarter, and Luke Moffett, a professor specializing in international humanitarian law, explained to me what that means.
When you're fighting the enemy and when they're injured or they're unconscious, you're supposed to capture them and treat them as prisoners of war. When you order no quarter, then soldiers are allowed to shoot them, those things are completely illegal.
Even the US Department of Defense's own manual gives a specific example about shipwrecked combatants, saying it would be a dishonorable and inhumane attack. Hegseth has denied that he gave that reported kill order, and actually he said he didn't see the survivors after the first strike because he'd already left the room. But crucially, he stands by that decision to carry out the second strike.
And by the way, Admiral Bradley made the correct decision to ultimately sink the boat and eliminate the threat.
In that same meeting, Donald Trump tried to distance himself from the whole situation.
I didn't know about the second strike. I didn't know anything about people. I wasn't involved in it. I knew they took out a boat.
Essentially, the White House is denying that Hegseth gave a specific order to kill them all, and that Admiral Bradley gave the order for a second strike. But regardless, it was all legal because it was in, quote, accordance with the laws of war. And on December the 4th, Admiral Bradley made similar arguments to members of Congress, and he told them there was no quarter order in place. But this is how a top Democrat reacted after watching footage of that second strike.
What I saw in that room was one of the most troubling things I've seen in my time in public service.
I spoke to John Bolton, who was Trump's national security advisor during his first term. He's currently indicted on federal charges brought by this Trump administration over the handling of classified information. He's pleaded not guilty. Now, he's not one of our legal experts, but he is a long-time critic of Venezuela and a supporter of US action in the region. And he told me he wasn't worried about whether this operation was legal, but that the administration's policy makes no sense.
Obviously, the lawyers will argue about one point or another. I just think the look is not good for the United States to be in a position of saying, well, we didn't really kill 2 innocent people. That's not an argument you want to be in.
The legal experts we've spoken to say that no quarter is illegal, both in peacetime law and the laws governing armed conflict. And regardless of who exactly made the decision, the ultimate order came from the president.
There's an important bigger picture here, which is that the President of the United States is ordering the United States military to engage in a campaign of killing outside of the law.
And they're not just questioning the legality of that double-tap strike on September the 2nd.
When you think about the campaign as a whole, that very first strike against what was alleged to be a boat ferrying what may have been cocaine, that strike itself was unlawful.
The White House argues that these boats are bringing drugs to the US, and that makes them legitimate targets in their war on drugs. But that doesn't really stack up, because an overwhelming majority of the drugs entering the US aren't coming from Venezuela. And since the strikes began, critics say that the amount of drugs entering the US hasn't gone down at all.
What law enforcement has said since the beginning of the strikes against drug boats, there's no appreciable decline in drugs coming into the United States.
The US already has the ability through law enforcement to stop drug smugglers from entering its waters. After the strikes on September the 2nd, the next day Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, basically confirmed that there was an option to stop the boat without using lethal force, which the president chose to ignore.
Instead of interdicting it on the president's orders, he blew it up. And it'll happen again.
Now, to strengthen the argument for the use of force, President Trump released this memo in October saying that drug cartels were, quote, unlawful combatants, and that the US is now in a non-international armed conflict. Under the Constitution, it's Congress that has the power to declare a war. But this memo basically meant that because the targets were the cartels and not a country, the president has the power to launch a military operation. So does this argument that the US is now at war make these strikes legitimate?
Armed conflict means armed. And what has been done is an attempt to draw an equivalency between drugs coming onto our shores and people firing weapons at us. An equivalency that does not exist under international law.
That was Major General Steve Lepper, and he used to be one of the US Air Force's top lawyers. He told us that the drug cartels the US is targeting haven't attacked American forces, and they haven't declared war on the US either. He doesn't believe the hostilities between the US and the cartels meet the threshold of warfare. And he's not alone.
There are no ongoing armed conflicts between the United States and drug cartels or organized gangs, despite what the administration has been claiming.
These different drug traffickers are not an armed group. They're not fighters or soldiers. It's not a war.
So the White House seems to be treating this war on drugs like previous administrations treated the war on terror. After the 9/11 attacks, Congress passed an act for the use of military force. That allowed the president to strike jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda and later ISIS. George W. Bush, Obama, and Trump all made use of this. So this administration could be betting that there's a similar legal basis for its attacks on the cartels. Pete Hegseth basically said as much.
How do you treat Al-Qaeda and ISIS? Do you arrest them and treat them, pat them on the head and say, don't do that again? Or do you end the problem directly by taking a lethal, kinetic approach? And that's the way President Trump has authorized the War Department to look at these cartels.
If that's the argument, then the justification would be that the US is defending itself against attacks on the nation. But there's little evidence the strikes were made in self-defense, or even that the people being killed are definitely gang members or directly involved in drug smuggling. Our US editor Anushka Astana spoke to a family in Trinidad who lost a relative, Chad Joseph, in a strike on October the 14th. They denied he was involved in the drug trade.
You can't even get a body to bury.
The Associated Press also spoke to people who knew 4 of the men killed in these strikes, and while they admitted they had been running drugs, they said they were not narco-terrorists, part of the cartel, or gang leaders. So even if some of these people are smugglers, they're not running the operation. They may even not be members of the groups the US is even targeting.
I think the crimes against humanity point is probably the issue. It's attack against the civilian population. These aren't soldiers. These are just, even if they're drug traffickers, they're not soldiers, and so you can't justify killing them. It's still murder.
Now, the White House still strongly maintains that these individuals are drug smugglers and legitimate targets.
Who has 5 engines on the back of a boat going in weird directions and loaded up with lots of white containers?
To sum all of this up, the legal experts I've spoken to are clear. The Trump administration is justifying these attacks as self-defense and as part of a legitimate war against the cartels.
The president has a right to take them out if they are threatening the United States of America and if they are bringing illegal narcotics that are killing our citizens at a record rate, which is what they are doing.
But even if the US was able to make the case that this is the legitimate campaign, that double-tap strike back on September the 2nd, regardless of who gave the order, was, according to our experts, almost certainly illegal, meaning those responsible could be prosecuted. So the big question, what happens now? Well, that could come down to this really important memo that was circulated by the White House back in July. That document was written by the Justice Department's Office of Legal Counsel. Now, it's important to say that that memo remains classified and we haven't seen it. But a number of officials who say they have spoken to journalists at the New York Times and the Washington Post. And they claim that the memo states that the US president is legally waging a non-international armed conflict against drug cartels, according to the powers granted to him by the US Constitution, and that any strikes against drug trafficking boats in Latin America are legal. So what does that mean? Essentially, that memo provides an advance pardon for anyone giving or carrying out orders for military strikes, often referred to as a golden shield. And it's what stopped the Obama administration from prosecuting members of the CIA who waterboarded suspects.
The way to look at it is turning to OLC for legal cover, much as was done under the W. Bush administration when OLC was turned to bless a campaign of torture. We need to see it as OLC was turned to purportedly justify a campaign of extrajudicial killings.
That memo would potentially apply to all strikes, absolving anyone of blame for the deaths of more than 80 people. But what about the double tap strike? What if Hegseth or Admiral Bradley are ultimately found guilty of a war crime? Would the Golden Shield cover that? It might. And experts think even if it didn't, then Trump could still use his presidential pardon instead. The bet by the White House seems to be that they can carry out these strikes without fearing legal repercussions.
Trump doesn't understand legal constraints, and he can't understand why lawyers in the government are constantly telling him, well, you can't do this and you can't do that and you can't do the other thing.
Back in February, Hegseth fired the top lawyers for the Army, Navy, and the Air Force.
The stated rationale was basically, we think that the law constrains military operations too much.
So if presidential pardons and golden shields could prevent any possible prosecution in the US, what about any legal action being taken from outside?
There is the possibility that other states whose nationals have been murdered in these strikes could prosecute individuals involved within their domestic courts.
As we said earlier, 2 committees in Congress are now looking into what's been going on, and they are promising vigorous oversight. But the likelihood is no one's going to get prosecuted for these strikes.
I certainly don't see this administration starting to prosecute anyone involved. In fact, we would more likely see, I think, pardons than we would see prosecutions.
This policy, this plan, will continue. The Trump administration has doubled down on the use of lethal force.
Anybody that's selling it into our country is subject to attack.
So not necessarily just Venezuela?
No, not just Venezuela, no.
But maybe this isn't about the drug cartels. Maybe it's about regime change. That's what John Bolton thinks.
Look, I support overthrowing Maduro. I think we've got a legitimate rationale to use military force. And I think it would be in the best interest of the United States and the Venezuelan people to do it.
The US has a long history of involvement in Latin America, albeit usually more covert. Just take the Monroe Doctrine. That's all about the US asserting its dominance over the Western Hemisphere, and it saw them repeatedly oust socialist and communist governments in the region.
America has been pouring troops into Panama.
The point is, we've been here before, the US meddling in the affairs of Latin America, and claiming they were doing it to protect the US, its citizens and interests. But there is something new here. It's how blatant they're being with these repeated strikes. It's the firing of those lawyers with decades of experience. It's the fact that politicians only started sounding the alarm because of that double tap strike and not because of all the others.
Admiral, General, what's your message to the American people?
And it's about the perception that there's no accountability.
It really just undermines the hard-won and hard-fought-for international law that was built with the United Nations. And we're just seeing it crumble around us.
The claim is that the President of the United States, on his constitutional authority alone, can order the military to take lethal action outside of the law. That ought to be chilling to anyone.
So I guess my question is this. If the White House has been able to conduct all of these strikes seemingly with complete freedom, does that mean the administration thinks that it can act with no consequences? Because if that's the case, there are serious concerns about what could happen next. Thank you for watching this latest episode of the FourSight. If you liked it, if you didn't like it, make sure you write in the comments. If you actually did like it, make sure you maybe subscribe to our channel. Thank you to all of the contributors in this video, especially those who helped me get my head around all these weird legal arguments. Now, if you're also interested in Donald Trump and his approach to, well, the law within his country, why not watch our other video on ICE and what he's been doing in American cities? And if you were actually interested in the Monroe Doctrine or what America's been doing in Latin America, say so in the comments and maybe we'll try and do that as the next episode of the FourSight.